Okay, so this is the lecture for chapter 6 about drawing, and I'm gonna go to my PowerPoint now. Okay, so I hope you can see that. Let me fix the chat so I can see the chat in case there's any. Last time I forgot to turn my audio on. So if you can't hear me right now, please uh, unmute yourself and say, I can't hear, because I can't make the chat come up right now. Um, okay. So, um, drawing is probably one of the first things that people think about when they think about visual art, about making visual art. So right now we've sort of gone over the basic purposes and functions of art and evaluating art and all that. But now we're going to start talking about art mediums. That is drawing, painting, photography. There's a lot more in your book, but we don't have time to go over all these different mediums. But it's interesting. You could just page through those chapters and look at the pictures and get an idea of all the different ways you can be an artist. I mean, it's pretty unlimited. And actually, when I started thinking of myself as an artist, I had a hard time settling on one medium because they're all so interesting. In the end, I settled on photography, drawing, and painting. But I still really love printmaking, and I still make a lot of craft objects. So, but today we're just talking about drawing. And really, I feel like all people who work in all media, even including photography, that drawing is so basic to all art media that all artists should do it and probably end up doing it on some level. Although when I was in graduate school, a lot of my fellow students didn't draw at all, which I couldn't really understand. But anyway, all right. So, but your book says that drawing basically serves three purposes, and I think this is right. That it can be, as it says here, a notation, a sketch, or a record of something that you saw, or that you remember, or even that you just imagine. It could be a study for another larger, more complex work, and I've used drawing that way a lot. Sometimes I make a preliminary drawing and then I transfer it to a sheet of watercolor paper and make the painting on that. But then drawings exist just as drawings, that as art forms that have no other real purpose other than existing as art. So that's fine too. Okay, so you may kind of wonder, let me see if I can get this out of the way. Okay, we'll put it up. Well, I want it to not block the, okay. All right, you may sort of wonder why people even draw anymore, since photography as a way of keeping a record, because um, if you wanted to record an important historical event or something, you would just record it with a camera, right? But there's situations where cameras are not appropriate or maybe just can't be used. So this is an example of that. So in the 1940s in England, this was the beginning of World War II, and the Nazis were bombing London pretty regularly in an event called the Blitz, where they were trying to demoralize English civilians and just get them to surrender. So, Churchill famously refused to, said, we will fight on the beaches, we will fight on the ground, we will fight and fight and fight, we'll never give up. All right, and so that turned out to be the case. So the English civilians, to escape these nightly bombings, would go down into the subway, basically the underground um, train tracks that they had built before. And in England, it's called the Tube. So I don't know if you've ever ridden a subway like in New York or Washington D.C. or something, but they're underground um, train stations, basically. So you can move around the city underneath the roads. So during the Blitz, Londoners would go down into the tube to sleep, which is kind of incredible to think about now. But they just carried their bedding, and whole families would go down there and sleep to get away from the bombs. So Henry Moore was commissioned by the British government to make drawings of this situation. I mean, nobody knew then whether the Nazis were going to win World War II and take over England or not. I mean, when we think about World War II, we think, oh yeah, the Nazis were real bad and the Allies defeated them. But nobody knew that in 1940. The United States had not yet entered the war, even. So Henry Moore went down into the tube station and made these drawings of people lying on the tracks, hiding from the bombs. I mean, obviously the trains weren't running. So here's another drawing from the tube drawings. I think it was mostly adults that were down there in the tubes, because the tube shelter, like a bomb shelter, because children had been evacuated mostly from London. They were sent out to live with people in the country. So the only people left in London were their parents. And sometimes children were separated from their parents for the duration of the war, like 4 years. So anyway, the parents still lived in London, worked in various factories, making material for the defense effort, and were sleeping in the tube shelter at night. So you may be able to think of some situations yourself that you've witnessed where you felt like you wanted to record it, but you felt like taking a photograph with your phone or whatever would just be inappropriate. For example, one day I was at the Allgood Walmart, and I saw a guy getting arrested on the sidewalk in front of Walmart, and he was kneeling on the ground and he was cuffed behind his back, and there was a cop there and his girlfriend, I think, who was making a phone call, and I thought, wow, this is pretty dramatic. But I felt like it would be just wrong to take a photograph. It would be like an invasion of his privacy or something. So I just went home and made a drawing of it. It wasn't a very good drawing. Okay, so again, let me see if I can move this kind of out of the way. I'm just going to minimize it for a minute. So another way to think about drawing as a kind of record is these Leonardo da Vinci drawings of human anatomy. So Leonardo was, and these were made in, unfortunately the text got covered up, but these were made in like the 1500s during the Renaissance in Italy. And Leonardo was really the first person to systematically study the structure of the human body, the skeleton, the muscles, the tendons, the way the heart worked, and other organs. Before that, medieval and early Renaissance artists had kind of a superficial understanding of how the body worked, but Leonardo really wanted to know the truth, and he actually dissected cadavers. So a dissection is where you have a dead body and you more or less take it apart and look to see how the muscles and tendons go together. If you've taken an anatomy course, you may have seen pictures in your anatomy text that look very much like this. Here you can see the bones of the feet, the ligaments of the shoulder and upper arm. And Leonardo got it pretty much right. He got a few things wrong as to how the heart actually works. Well, he figured out eventually how it works using an experiment, how it pumps blood, but his picture of it was not entirely accurate. His picture of the uterus was wrong. But for the most part, he got it right. And for Leonardo, art was not separate from science. We usually nowadays we sort of think of the humanities, oops, as being completely separate from science and technology, but that was not the case in the Renaissance. Leonardo was both an artist, a scientist, an anatomist, really, and an engineer. He designed all sorts of machines. So all of these things for him were about studying reality, about studying nature and the world, including the human body. So there's more content about this in the eLearn part of the course. In the chapter 6 module, there's a link to a video about Leonardo and his drawings that's really interesting. Okay, so another point that your book makes is that some drawing is, you could think of it um, as projective. Well, let's talk about receptive drawing first. So receptive drawing, and again, I can't make the chat come up, so I can't write receptive, but it's on the list of terms that I'm going to put in your content. A receptive drawing is where you're looking at something and you're recording it, as you see it. And so this Mary Cassatt drawing, she's sitting on the bus, in France called the omnibus, and across from this grouping of people, 2 women, a baby, and a man that she didn't really finish drawing. And so she's making this sort of sketch. Just, visual stimuli is coming into her eyes and she's recording it. She's not really changing it that much. Maybe I think she went on to make a print based on this drawing. So it was a preparatory study, but it was a receptive drawing. Now, a projective drawing is where you draw something that nobody has ever seen. Only you have seen it in your mind, So this artist, Martin Ramirez, was an outsider artist or an untrained artist. And he did a lot of these kind of fantasy drawings, you could say, or dream drawings. I mean, if you think about it, this is impossible. It's hard to even quite figure out what he's thinking. But it looks like a train comes around a corner in some sort of weird building, and then it disappears. It just vanishes, and then it comes out on the other side of this. Is this a arch over a train track, or a void, or a tunnel? I mean, what is it? It's not clear, but the train is headed into another tunnel. So a lot of drawing, I think, in contemporary art is like this. It comes from the imagination, and maybe it could never actually happen. But a lot of drawing, as you'll see as the course goes on, is sort of a combination of those two things. Like the artist has seen something like the human body, and then the artist imagines that body, a human body, doing something, sometimes transformed into an angel with wings or something. So, is that receptive or projective? I mean, nobody's ever seen an angel, but maybe it's, so in that sense it's projective, but it's based on things that you have seen. All right. So I don't know, that's just something I hadn't really thought about until I started teaching this course and read that text. Okay, so a lot of people, I've heard a lot of people say, I can't draw. And I think a lot of people think that it's some sort of, you either got it or you ain't. That is, you're either born with the ability to draw or you are not. And that's just not true. Anybody can learn to draw. Some people obviously have more ability maybe to draw than from early on than other people, but it's a learnable skill, like learning to type or ride a bicycle or something like that. And even some very great artists that you've heard of, like Van Gogh, for example, couldn't draw very well in the beginning. So this drawing, you can see Van Gogh was really struggling to draw. He came to art after trying a lot of other careers that he kind of failed at. So I mean, this is just awkward. The head is way too big for the rest of the body. The eyes are not in the right place. They're too high in the skull. So if you look at my head or anybody else's head, the eyes are pretty much, here's the top of my head, here's the bottom. My eyes are not up here. They're more or less in the center, maybe slightly higher than the center of my skull. But like a lot of people, Van Gogh put the eyes way too high, and then the ear is not in the right place. Okay, your the top of your ear lines up with the corner of your eye normally. But he drew this ear like way up there. The hands are not realistic looking. They're too big. And just the whole body posture is kind of wrong. So this is 1880. 2 years later, Van Gogh could draw. He really he put in the time, he put in the work, he learned to draw with the help of a book on linear perspective. So we talked about linear perspective before. And he wrote to Theo, his brother, I finally got a book about linear perspective, and it really helped me. And you can see he drew the chair in perspective. Like there's a vanishing point over here somewhere because he's looking down on this chair with this man. And he's figured out that when a person has their head down like that, their ear sort of seems to be further from the top of their head. Hey, Cody. So he's got, and the hands are a million times better. Your hand is not square. You know, it's your knuckles are round, kind of, and it takes a long time to learn to draw hands in a realistic way. But he figured it out. Okay, you jump up here. Here's Cody. He likes to sit on the sofa, and I'm zooming. So he didn't really, Van Gogh didn't allow himself to paint until he figured out how to draw. And he spent a long time on that. And he mastered it. Okay, so when I lived in Houston, I took a great drawing class from an artist, Luis Jimenez. And it met for 6 hours once a week on Wednesdays. It was exhausting. But I learned a whole lot from Luis. And one of the things he used to tell people in that class is that it's not, again, it's not something you just are born with. Anybody can learn to draw. It just takes time and effort. So, yeah, I think that's true. Okay, so let's go on to another purpose of drawing, which is making a study for a later work of art. We're going to look at two examples, Michelangelo and Picasso. Okay, so Michelangelo, famous Renaissance artist, one of the greatest drafts persons that's ever lived. So a draftsman is a person who draws. And this is a small drawing, maybe about the size of a sheet of notebook paper. So in the Renaissance, drawings were often preparatory studies for a painting or a larger work, a fresco. In this case, this was a preparatory drawing for a fresco. So we'll talk on Wednesday about what a fresco is, but basically it's a painting on a wall on wet plaster that once it dries, it's there forever. So he was commissioned by the Pope to make some big paintings in the Sistine Chapel in Rome about Bible stories, basically, and he decided to make them about the book of Genesis. So this is a preparatory drawing for the creation of Adam. So this is the painting, part of the painting, where God is transmitting a spark of life to Adam. Okay, so this was the final fresco painting. and this is the preparatory drawing. So you can see Michelangelo understood anatomy very well. He also, like Leonardo, did dissections of cadavers. Now, dissection of a dead body was not exactly legal in the Renaissance, but somehow Michelangelo and Leonardo both managed to acquire the bodies of criminals, people who had been executed, in order to dissect them. So it was, they kind of had to do it on the down low, you could say. But Michelangelo also just studied the human figure by hiring models and using people who worked for him in his studio as models. And he was especially interested in the male body, and he understood the male body perfectly, I feel like. So yeah, Michelangelo, this is called a study for a larger work. And you can see that if you look closely, you can see that he drew grid lines over the drawing. So once the drawing was made, he would draw a grid in charcoal, maybe, over the drawing. And then when he went to the site, the job site, you could say, where he was going to make the painting, he could draw the grid on the wet plaster and then just looking at the drawing, transfer it by hand, freehand, to the wall. Most people couldn't do that. Most people needed an intermediate step called a cartoon. So a cartoon in the Renaissance was not a animated Bugs Bunny cartoon. A cartoon was a full-scale drawing that was preparatory to a fresco or a tapestry or some other work. So not very many of these cartoons survived because they were made on paper and they were fragile. But these two cartoons did survive. They're not by Michelangelo, they're by a different Italian Renaissance artist, Francesca Salviati. So the way most Renaissance artists worked was they would make a cartoon, a study, that is a small drawing. Paper was expensive in the Renaissance, so people made small preparatory drawings, and then and also paper didn't come in big wide rolls like it does now. You can see where the paper has been kind of glued together. So they had to glue sheets of paper together on the back, and then with strips of pasted paper, and then make oh good, I can make the chat come up now. I don't know why it's hard to make that come up. And then they could make a full-size drawing that would then be transferred to the wet plaster with a stylus, or sometimes by poking little holes around the contour. So you could poke little holes around the contour of your cartoon and then put black dust, a bag of black dust, which was called pounce. And so then when you took the drawing away, there would be a dotted line on the wet plaster that you could use to start your drawing. But Michelangelo was such an accomplished draftsman that he could just look at his little study and draw freehand from there, apparently. Okay, so this way of working, of making a study followed by maybe a cartoon, an intermediary full-scale cartoon, followed by the painting, that's not just for Renaissance artists. Picasso rejected in the 20th century most of the traditional painting methods of the Renaissance, but he still was really big on making studies as preparations for drawings. So this little study, he numbered them and kept them. All right, so this is number 1, 1st of May 1937, a small drawing on like a piece of notebook paper, the size of that, for a preparatory study for Guernica. And Guernica ended up being a gigantic painting, like 20 feet long or more, 10 feet tall that Picasso made for the World's Fair in Paris for the Spanish pavilion. He was actually a Spaniard, although he's living in Paris. And he was commissioned by the Spanish government to make a painting for the Spanish pavilion. So Picasso ended up making this painting about a war crime that had just occurred, like days before he started working on this painting. It was almost like ripped from the headlines, you could say. And what happened was, and let's just go ahead to that slide before I show you the painting. Okay, so what happened was, by 1937, the Nazis were in power in Germany, the Third Reich, and they were planning to invade the rest of Europe, really, to their east and to their west. They were planning to invade Poland and the Ukraine and all of that. And they were also planning to invade France, and Spain. So to do that, they were planning to use aerial bombardment of cities, like in the Blitz when they bombed England. But they hadn't tried it yet. In fact, nobody in the world had ever used aerial bombardment of civilians to kind of make a point, you could say, to subdue another country. There'd been shelling, sure. In World War I, there was a lot of shelling, and a lot of towns ended up looking like this. Aerial bombardment, though, is not like shelling. Shelling is surface to air missiles that are like cannons, basically, shot from the ground towards somebody. But aerial bombardment was new in World War II, and as I'm sure you know, it involves airplanes flying over cities and dropping bombs. That's how war is conducted now. That's what we did in the Iraq War. That was what Operation Shock and Awe was. It was aerial bombardment of civilians in order to force surrender. But it had never been tried. Okay, so the Nazis wanted to kind of try it out. And the reason they did it in Spain was that General Franco in Spain was staging a military coup at this time. That is, he was trying to overthrow the democratically elected government of Spain. And his movement to overthrow the government was a fascist movement headed by General Franco. They call themselves fascists. They invented the term, basically. It wasn't what other people called them. They said, nope, we're fascist. Okay, so Hitler made an alliance with Franco, and together they decided to try out aerial bombardment on the city of Guernica, which was a small city of a few thousand people. It would be like if somebody bombed Livingston to rubble. And, of course, civilians had no idea this was going to happen, and the people that were killed in the bombardment had nothing to do with the civil war that was going on. So in that sense, it was a war crime, and Picasso was shocked by it. All right, so this is his first drawing for this painting about Guernica. And there's a woman kind of leaning out of a window holding a torch. This is a common motif in Picasso's work. There's a bull in the background, and it looks like a horse with its hooves in the air. And then this is just kind of a placeholder. I don't know what Picasso was thinking, but he obviously made this drawing really quickly. Okay, so then it evolved into a larger study. So on a bigger piece of paper, 9.5 by about 18. And you can see the woman with the candle or torch is still present. The bull is still present. The horse is now on the ground. And there are other figures, a woman apparently holding a child. There are flames coming out of a building, and a horse's hooves. So, I'm not sure how many drawings he made as preparation for Guernica, but over the course of just a week, he made a lot of these drawings. Okay, so this is the painting. And in your content, oops, again, this is sort of covering things up, so I'm going to. in your content, there's a link to a high resolution scan of Guernica so that you can look at the different parts of it. You can zoom in on the different parts of it, and it's a really interesting painting to do that. But let's just sort of look at it as a whole for now. So this is what the drawing evolved into. It's a black and white painting. It was not in color. It was in a monochrome grayscale painting, almost as if it's a newspaper photograph, right? But obviously it's not a photograph. So the woman with the candle leaning out the window is still present. There's a screaming woman. Their flames are there coming out of a house. There is a woman kind of crawling almost, and a woman holding a dead child over here. This is apparently a man with a severed arm and a sword and a screaming horse. And weirdly, even though it seems to be happening outside in the street, there's an overhead light that's sort of creating this triangle of light that sort of creates a composition that divides the painting into three parts. So there's this part, the middle part, and then this part. So that's sort of compositional unity thing. The bull is still present. The bird is much harder to see. It's back here somewhere. So, and then there's this newsprint kind of texture that looks like newspaper text. So again, I suggest that you go to the content for chapter 6, look at the zoom in, go to the link to the high-res scan of this and check it out, because it's an amazing painting, really huge. Okay, so now we're going to talk about some of the tools that artists use when they're drawing and painting, that are basically, or drawing basically. They divide into two categories: dry media and wet media. So dry media would be like graphite pencils. I don't know if you know this. Let me get some of this stuff. I put some of it over here so I can actually. Okay, so most people think that pencils are made out of lead because we refer to the black part of the pencil as a lead, but it's really not. I mean, it may have been at one time. A pencil lead is actually made out of a mineral called graphite. It's not toxic. Lead would be. Okay, so here's a graphite pencil. There's the graphite. You can also get graphite and just stick it into a holder. That's what I have here. I like those a lot. Okay, other kinds of dry media include Conte crayon and charcoal. So I'm going to show you a Conte crayon. So a Conte crayon is kind of a combination of graphite and clay. So this is what Michelangelo used to make that drawing we were looking at a minute ago. This stuff is awesome. It's basically unchanged from the Renaissance. And you know, this is going to sound like an ad for Hobby Lobby. I don't mean it to be, but Hobby Lobby has all of this stuff, including this graphite that's just like Renaissance. I mean, this Conte crayon. Okay, so there's also charcoal. Here's a little teeny piece of charcoal. Charcoal is usually made out of willow that's been, you know, kind of baked. Charcoal is great. It's soft. It's easily erased. I love charcoal. Okay. So wet media, underneath that, obviously a brush with some ink. You know what a brush looks like. Then there's these pens. Again, one of my favorite tools. This is called a Croquill pen or a dip pen. So it's a really sharp pen. There's no ink cartridge built in. In fact, you can pull this thing off. You can put different points in here. So you stick this in a bottle of ink and then you draw. And we'll talk about that in a minute when I show you Steve Mumford's work. But more conveniently, There's these Pigma Micron pens, which again you can get at Hobby Lobby. They're like a sort of a fancy Sharpie, and that's actually what I used more often than the dip pens. Although the dip pens are cool. Okay, so the even a Sharpie is actually wet media. It may not seem all that wet. Okay, so here's all the colors that Conte Crayon comes in. So since it comes in all these sort of shades of brown, it's great for people, for drawing people, portraits, life drawing. Um, so this is it's the type of paper that you use dry media on is pretty important, especially charcoal or Conte Crayon. It a textured paper that has a lot of little nooks and crannies in it is good because it holds the pigment, the dust. But then you have to spray it with some kind of fixative. In the 19th century, apparently artists brushed the back of the drawing with fixative, but nowadays we spray it on. Some of the fixative is really toxic. You're supposed to do it under a hood, you know. So I don't have a hood, so I use the non-toxic fixative to keep it from smudging later. Okay, so there's also pastels, which are basically pure pigment suspended in a kind of with chalk, white chalk, or different in a kind of in a stick. And here's some examples of these are high-end pastels, Unison pastels. I used to have a few of these. Now, I love pastels. Again, I told you I have a hard time restricting myself to one medium, and so I've tried them all. And I love pastels. The problem with pastels is that you have to be kind of careful because the pigments that are suspended in the sticks can be toxic. Like the yellows and oranges are often made out of chrome, so you have to wear gloves. It creates a lot of dust. You have to wear a dust mask. You have to be carefully vacuum up everything when you're done so that your space doesn't become contaminated with toxic dust. It's kind of too much trouble for me, although it can be really incredibly rewarding to draw with pure pigment. And traditionally, pastels are used for children's portraits because it's the sort of soft quality of children's skin tones can be easily communicated with pastels. But the Impressionists loved pastels because of especially in the late 19th century, new, more intense and saturated colors of pastels came along. And it's just a very immediate way to draw, you know. You can sort of draw and paint at the same time. I think that's what people like about it. Okay, so wet media would be like, you know, the using these pens or a brush just to put liquid pigment directly on paper. In Asia, this is the main way to draw. It's people in Asia traditionally have written with a brush because they traditionally use calligraphy in China and Japan, Korea. So it's natural to move from writing you know, a letter or a poem with a brush to drawing with a brush. And there's some real advantages to drawing with a brush. You can vary the width of the line very easily in a way that you can't with graphite or even with a dip pen. So, you know, you can see that Hokusai was able to use the very tip of the brush to make these fine lines. And then by pushing down a little harder on the brush, he could go from a fine line to a thick line and then back to a thin line. So Hokusai was a master of that. This drawing may have been a preparatory study for a woodcut, which was his main medium, which is kind of printmaking. But this is just a great drawing. I mean, if you look really closely, you can see how masterful the fingers are. So this is a woman tuning a stringed instrument with 3 strings, sort of like a banjo, but only with 3 strings. And she's kind of plucking with her right hand and turning the pegs with her left hand. And it's just the movement of her hands that's a really hard thing to do, but Hokusai nailed it. And then there's this beautiful flowing kimono that she's wearing. Okay, so there are artists who use wet media to sketch. It's kind of more demanding than graphite or, you know, Sharpie pen. But this guy, Steve Mumford, I discovered him when I was just wandering around the Frist Art Museum in Nashville one day. There was a exhibit of his drawings from Iraq. So Steve Mumford's a really interesting guy. He traveled to Iraq on his own dime when the war started in, I guess, 2002 or so. And instead of being a war photographer, he's a war artist, you could say. Like he just sets himself down in some part of Baghdad and starts drawing. So initially, if we have time, we'll play a little video of Steve Mumford talking about how he works, and you can see his pad and he uses a dip pen like this, and he holds the bottle of ink. I mean, it's pretty hard. There's a lot going on. He has pens and brushes sticking out of his mouth that he's holding. So it's a challenging way to work, but I think the results are great. You know, he can use a brush to make these dark shapes, and he can use the pen to make, you know, really crisp lines. And then sometimes he reworks these drawings into really large scale paintings, and they had a few of those at the Frist too. So the other thing that I think is really remarkable about works on paper, let's just call them drawings on paper, is that they can be almost like a form of graphic novel journalism. So you can see that Steve Mumford added text to speech bubbles to this awful scene. Okay, what it is, it says up here, Iraq's parliament members after bomb in cafeteria, April 12th, 2007. So I don't know if y'all remember very much from 2007, but that was kind of the worst year of the Iraq war, where it was clear that things were not, it wasn't mission accomplished. It was just deteriorating into this awful civil war. And so, but Steve Mumford was still there, you know, and so these guys who were part of the Iraqi parliament have been brought into presumably the green zone, where American soldiers and medics can work on them. And I can't read this because something's covering it up, but it says, "Miss, can you put some vodka in the IV tube? That would be good." Yes. So you have a female doctor or medic back here and a guy setting up an IV, and this poor guy who's something bad's happened to him, maybe shrapnel from the bomb, and he's in pain, so he's asking for vodka in the IV tube. So Steve Mumford calls this a mass cas event. That is a mass casualty event, of which there were legion in this time. There were a lot of car bombs, and 30 people would get killed in 2 minutes. So it was pretty bad. I knew some people who were in Iraq at that time. Maybe you do too. So if we have time, we'll look at the video of Steve Mumford talking about how he works. Okay, so speaking of putting text with drawings, let me move this so I can read this. Okay, so this is from a book called Maus. You can see it's spelled mouse in German, about 30 years ago. So Maus was one of the first graphic novels. Graphic novels are really popular now. In fact, if you go to Books A Million or something, excuse me, you'll see a whole section devoted to graphic novels. Graphic novels are like serious comic books. I mean, maybe they're not all serious, but they're not funny, most of them. So it's a way of telling a story with words and pictures in sort of comic book style. So Art Spiegelman was really the first person to figure out that you could use comic book style, that is, you know, a series of squares or a grid, um, with pictures and text to tell a serious story. And this is a Holocaust story. I mean, it doesn't get any more serious than that. So Art Spiegelman's parents were Holocaust survivors who came from Poland, I think. They both survived the Holocaust. They were separated during World War II. This is before Art Spiegelman was born. They were already married. They were separated, as so often was the case, and with Jewish families. But amazingly, both Art Spiegelman's father and his mother survived the Holocaust and reunited after the war and left, obviously, uh, as you do, and came to the United States. And that's where Art Spiegelman and his sister were born. And his parents really didn't talk about the Holocaust very much. And that's also typical of Holocaust survivors, that a lot of times they just didn't talk to their kids about it. But towards the end of his dad's life, Art Spiegelman got him to talk about it. And the dad is represented by this little mouse with glasses. So Art Spiegelman imagines the Jews as mice. And see, instead of the yellow star, they're wearing a little M on their sleeve that means mouse. And then the Nazis he imagines as cats, hunting the mice, really, the Jews. And this is about the Warsaw Ghetto. So this was a walled off section of Warsaw in Poland, where Jews were kind of incarcerated. So the father is saying it was fences put up around. No mouse could go out from the ghetto. No food and medicine could go in. They treated us like we were insects. Worse, I can't even describe. So I've read some stuff about the Warsaw Ghetto, and that's it in a nutshell. People were literally starving in there. All right, so Art Spiegelman imagines, this Nazi cat has caught this Jewish mouse and has a pistol in his mouth. Pretty terrifying. The success of Maus and the fact that it was so powerful inspired a lot of other graphic novels, and we could spend a whole lecture just talking about graphic novels, but instead I'm going to talk about comics. Okay, so comics, there was this whole, spelled with an X, there was this whole genre of underground comics, you could say, in the 60s and 70s. And again, these were not supposed to be funny, although sometimes they were. A lot of times they contained adult situations and language, you could say, particularly the work of R. Crumb. And R. Crumb, I believe, is one of the greatest draftsmen that's ever lived. Certainly one of the best American draftsmen. And Art Crumb uses this, I didn't know this for a long time, but Art Crumb, and this just increased my respect for him, he uses this very simple tool, this dip pen, dipped in ink, to make his drawings. And you can see that these drawings are kind of ruthless. Like, this is a self-portrait. This is R. Crumb. And he looks pretty terrible, right? You can see every little wrinkle, every hair, his sort of scruffy mustache, the pores on his nose. But that's kind of how he looks. I mean, he's not particularly pretty. And in the background here, you can see this technique of the dip pen cross-hatching, where if you want to make a shaded area, you just do this cross-hatching stuff. But he's managed to sort of create dark and light areas to model the volume of his face with cross-hatching too, which is pretty impressive, I think. One of my favorite things about Art Crumb and how I kind of got interested in him in the 70s was because he made a lot of drawings for a magazine that I used to read called the Coevolution Quarterly. And his drawings of women in particular really impressed me because In the 70s, women were supposed to be kind of frail looking. Like you're supposed to be super thin and you weren't supposed to look powerful or athletic or strong. But R. Crumb drew these really, really strong looking, muscular women. And not just because they were prehistoric cave girls. He also drew farmer girls that way. And it turned out, I didn't know this at the time, but his wife, Eileen, who's also a cartoonist, she's sort of a bodybuilder. So I think that's what inspired him to make these really powerful looking, muscular women. I mean, it's kind of funny a lot of times, but sometimes it's pretty serious. Like this is kind of an existential despair. Nobody understands. And of course, how could they? So yeah, look up R. Crumb. You'll find a lot of interesting stuff. All right, so now we're going to look at a really gigantic drawing. So, you know, most drawings are maybe the size of my sketchbook or whatever, sometimes a little bigger, but this is so big that, I mean, most people would call it a painting. It's sort of on the borderline between drawing and painting, I would say. And this artist, Julie Mehretu, is famous for her monumental drawings slash paintings. So this is on a wall at a bank in Lower Manhattan, and she got the commission to make this right before the crash of 2008, 2009, when the banks kind of made a lot of mistakes, and you know, the subprime mortgage incident where they made a lot of bad loans and it caused this worldwide economic collapse. It was kind of the fault of these banks in Lower Manhattan. So when she got the commission to make this painting, nobody kind of knew that that was bubbling under the surface. And she took the commission and decided to make this monumental painting about global capitalism. And she started working on it in her studio in Berlin where there was more space. Then the crash happened. And I think it's really interesting that the painting kind of almost is a prophecy of that. We'll when we watch the video, you can think about whether that's true or not. But in what sense is this a drawing? I think that's one thing we need to talk about. Okay, so it's in the drawing, the painting slash drawing is in 4 layers, and she makes a layer, and it's on canvas. So there's these, it's maybe a little hard to see here, but there's architectural drawings underneath all these abstract shapes done with ink and brushes and pens. And then she puts a layer of acrylic varnish down, has one of her assistants sand that layer, but it's still transparent. And then she puts more on top of that. And so she just keeps adding more and more drawing, more and more shapes, some of which is really, I would call painting, on top of these drawings. And in between each of the 4 layers, there's another layer of varnish, of acrylic varnish, that's then been sanded to make a nice drawing surface for the next layer. And then at the very end, she took a brush and painted Sumi ink gesture marks on top. So is it a drawing or is it a painting? It's hard. It's got elements of drawing, this sort of linear quality of drawing in it, but it's also got these painted shapes. So in a way, a lot of curators and museums have sort of stopped worrying about if something is a drawing or a painting, and they categorize things as either works on paper or works on canvas, which makes it simpler because they have to be preserved in different ways, really. Works on paper are more fragile and have to be cared for in a different way than works on canvas. Okay, so I'm going to get out of PowerPoint now. Stop my share. And let's see what time it is. Oh, okay. Well, we don't really have time to watch those videos about Steve Mumford and Julie Mehretu, so I would recommend that you go to the content and watch those videos on your own, because they shed a lot of light on both Steve Mumford's way of working and Julie Moretu's, particularly Julie Moretu's use of the computer as a kind of drawing tool or drafting tool. Like instead of a sketchbook, like, or a piece of paper like Michelangelo or Picasso, she makes her drawings in the computer. Then she takes a picture. Once that layer's there, she photographs it, imports it into her computer again, and starts adding more layers in her computer. And then once she's happy with that, she shows it to her assistant, and the assistant puts another layer on. So it's also a way of drawing that involves, it's kind of like a factory. She's got all these employees doing a lot of the drawing. Okay, so any questions about that before well, I'm going to stop recording.